So this is a talk about interaction design, a kind of practical guide. My name is Erik Engheim. I work for a company called 60 North. I have some of my colleagues here. We do consulting throughout the Nordic region and workshops and training, primarily in Python, software architecture. One of my specialities is a programming language called Julia, which is used in high-performance computing, data science, machine learning. So I thought before I start, I was a bit curious what kind of audience I actually have. How many here are interaction designers, or how many are software engineers actually? And are there any actually interaction designers here? Okay. Yeah, so this talk is, the way a lot of this material came about is really aimed at developers and not designers specifically. And the reason for that is that I spent a lot of years working in the oil and gas industry with kind of software, highly technical software for specialists. And in that industry, there's not really a tradition of doing much interaction design or having specialists in this field employed. So it's something that I cared about a long time, so I kind of had to take it on myself, even though I'm not really educated as an interaction designer, to try to learn this better, to try to improve our software. So I spent a lot of time trying to teach other developers and having workshops and so on interaction design. So this is a bit hands-on guide, but I'm also going to cover some theory, because what I find, especially when you're doing reviews of other people's UIs, or when you're just going through it yourself, is it's helpful to know some theory to kind of point out why something is good. Otherwise, people just think it's just a subjective opinion, and my opinion is just as good as anybody else's. So it's good to sort of know why you want to do something. So these are the topics I'm going to cover. First one, layout and hierarchy. That is about basically where you place UI components. So by UI components, I mean things like a checkbox, a drop-down box, and so on. And their relationship between each other. Visual balance, it's not UX per se. It's more about the aesthetics. It's just how to make the user interface look more pleasing based on how you place things. Labeling and typography, I think this is a quite important part. What I found when I'm doing user testing is that it's very cheap to actually improve your user interface simply by changing the labels that you're using in your software. Then I'm going to talk about the limits of human memory, how our short-term and long-term memory, the kind of flaws with that, how that affects your user interface design. I'm going to talk a little bit about trade-offs. Of course, there's lots of nice things you want to do, but you can't always do all the same things. What should you prioritize? How do you determine what to prioritize? And then choose the right control is a bit of a practical guide to when should I use this kind of UI component, when should I use that kind of UI component. And then finally, I'm going to talk about icon design, and it's not the kind of thing like a graphics designer would care about, like how do I draw an isometric view for this icon, or how do I make it pretty. This is more about what kind of motif are you going to use in an icon to communicate to the user what it's for or how it should be used, as well as maybe if you're going to give suggestions to a professional designer and you want to sketch something, what sort of design should you give to them. So let's start with layout and hierarchy. So this is about showing what is related to what and how. So this starts with what's called the Gestalt principles. And there are a lot of these principles, not just the 4 that I'm showing here. This is from psychology, and it's about how we humans observe and perceive shapes and objects that we're looking at and their relationship. So I put 4 here, but I'm only really going to talk about the 3 first ones, because I think those are the most important. So the first one, proximity, is about how the closeness or remoteness of objects affect how you perceive them. Then you have continuity, also referred to as continuation, which is about alignment of objects. And then similarity, which is about color and shape. So let's look at proximity first. You can see here we have these squares represents some UI components. That could be a text field, button, whatever. There's no particular relationship that we see here now. When you go over the next picture here, you can see that you perceive this now as 3 separate bars, despite the fact that there are actually 12 independent objects here. So by introducing space between, you create the impression that these are two separate objects. You can, of course, do this in any way you want. As you see here, you have these 4 different islands at the end. Continuity or continuation is about alignment. So if you look at the first picture, you can see these are just scattered about. There's no impression of what belongs to what. But as you're aligning these in different directions, so for instance, you align them horizontally, you perceive this as one logical group of components. It could be aligned along a diagonal for another group, or of course on the vertical. With similarity, we're using shapes and color. So you see that I haven't introduced any kind of extra space here, but still you perceive that this is 4 different rows. And the final image, again, there's no new space, but we're changing the shapes. So we create the illusion of 4 different areas. So that's the theory. It might not be obvious how this applies in practice, so we're going to look at some practical examples. So this is just a silly example. I didn't want to use actual concrete software and make fun of any particular software. So you can see already there's some of these principles applied. If you look at the plus and the minus button, you can see proximity is applied. They are close to each other. That suggests that if they were far away, they might not affect the same kind of object. So they're most likely adding and removing similar kinds of objects. They're aligned, which also suggests there's relation, and they're similar shape and size. So we have the similarity Gestalt principle. However, there's something wrong here. It's not obvious to the user looking at this. Am I going to be adding superheroes or supervillains if I click on these buttons? It might be unfortunate if you make a mistake here and you're adding the supervillains instead. To clarify this, you can use the proximity principle and introduce space to signal that this is not a related object and make it just close to the superheroes list to indicate that that's the list being affected. Here is an example kind of inspired from the kind of software I worked on. It's not important what these options are, but it gives the impression that we have 4 different options that you can modify. But that's not actually what this is supposed to work as. This is supposed to be 2 separate groups. So these are, the options are not related. So by introducing space along the vertical here, we can indicate that these are 2 separate groups, and we moved these labels closer so that it's clear which label belongs to which group. Here's another example. You can see in the center here, we have all one and invert. This is something we used a lot in the software I use. It's because there's a lot of lists where you can select things. For instance, it could be oil wells that you're using as input to some algorithm. And you want to have ways of affecting the selection. What's frequently not obvious is what list does these buttons apply to? So again, we just introduce space to clarify this. Now, in my next example, this underscores that these principles for design, they're not limited to designing, say, a desktop application or a web application, but they're quite generic. This applies to if you're designing a magazine page, if you're designing a flyer for an invitation. So this is a hypothetical invitation to a fjord cruise with NDC. So when you look at that initially, it's not easy to see at a glance, what is this for, when is it happening, and so on. We can improve on this by introducing some white space. It's a little clearer what this is about now, but we can make it even better by using hierarchy, white space, and typography in the appropriate manner. So you can see here that we made in large fonts what's really important, what this is about, that it's a Oslo Fjord shrimp cruise. And of course, the other thing that's important is when is it happening, where is it happening, so we're also emphasizing those, whereas the more details about this is de-emphasized. Of course, if you emphasize everything because you think everything is important, essentially you're making nothing important. So making something important requires you to de-emphasize something else. So let's look at these principles a little bit more structured that we're using, this visual hierarchy. So these principles are based on how we read from left to right or top to bottom, at least in a typical Western culture. So you can see that I have these two labels here, M and D. These represent what we call master and detail. So master and detail, these are just UI components, one or more. And master are the UI components that affect or change in some way the detail level. So a master could be, say, just a checkbox. You check it and then you enable or disable the detail region. It could be a drop-down box and you make a change there and that changes maybe what UI components are available in D. The point in having these kind of structured approach is you might have used software where you make a choice and then it's kind of random scattered about all sorts of parts of your UI changes and it's disorienting. So this is helping people have things happen as they would expect it. Another way to indicate this relationship is to have the detail on the right side. We can do this in a column-wise manner. So you see there, in the master level, we have a selection S, and that selection will change what you see in the detail level. The I at the bottom, it's just to indicate that, of course, you can have things that are outside the sort of master-detail relationship, sort of an independent area. We can nest this at any level we want. So here we have that A is a master of B, B is a master of C, and so on. Just increase the indentation level. We can have a column-wise view. So you make some selection in A, and that affects what you see in B, and allows you to make a new selection that affects C, and so on. Finally, we can put all of this together. So this is kind of how you would often look at the overall view of an application, the main page. So we can imagine this represents, say, a 2D drawing application. Maybe it's an email application or an integrated development environment. And what you would have is in A, maybe you select a page that you want to work on in your software. And then in B, you see that actual page with the graphics that you have designed. And you can make a selection in B, and then you see the details, the properties, and so on of that object in C. So you see you start from the left, and which is the top level, and then you move down, drill downwards towards the right. So this is one of the reasons I don't particularly like you see in some operating systems, you allow the user to move a lot around where they have these different areas. It kind of breaks the sort of natural expectations of how these things move. So let's look at some examples of what I mean by these more abstract representations. The column view, that is was popularized in the Next operating system for their file manager. That's carried over to Mac OS, if you're familiar with that. And now you can even see it in some Linux distributions. This is, I think, Elementary OS that has a file manager with this column view. So when you're selected projects here, you see all the directories under projects, and you can keep drilling down like that. Next is hierarchy using indentation. So here you see a use of indentation, and here you're placing it to the right. So these are the master levels that affect the detail level below here. And you can see as you look further along, as you're enabling something at the master level, you open up the sort of the next master level that controls the level, the detail level below, and so on. So likewise, if I had selected this one, of course, I would have enabled on the hour and custom voices. So let's look a bit at visual balance. You shouldn't prioritize this too strongly because, of course, the Gestalt principles are more important, but this is just about helping you make the user interface look a bit nicer. So the general idea here is to imagine that this is on a scale, and this is the center where you're balancing something. And you're imagining that the UI components have a weight or a mass, and it's proportional to how large they are. So what you see here is that this is very imbalanced. It's tipping over on this side. So how do we fix this? We just slide some of the parts over. So now you can see it's balanced along the vertical and the horizontal. Here's another example. We balance it again. This example is something you see often when you have multiple tabs. You have maybe a lot of components on some of the first tabs, and there are others that have very few components. So everything is squashed up at the top left corner, and you have all this other empty space around there. So a solution to that is place it in the middle and use more space around the components to arrange it more nicely. So a lot of these things might seem very obvious. And maybe it doesn't make sense to be told a lot of things, but I think the point of this is that if you hadn't been told at first, you might not have thought about it as you're kind of going through your own user interfaces or somebody else's. So this kind of provides a checklist. When you're looking at a user interface, you can think, am I doing proximity the right way? Am I doing alignment the right way? And so on. So let's look at labeling and typography. Just start with some simple things, contrast and color. So obviously you should have a good contrast. So typically like a black on a white background for clear readability. I've seen there's some discussion back and forth on this. Some people say, and I actually prefer that myself, but I guess people vary in that. I like it to not be too strong. So you can see that I'm using a dark gray color here rather than black. Although this, I'm not sure this screen here reproduces that well. But I think we can all agree that if you have this kind of contrast, that is not going to work very well. It's also worth thinking about color. And the way we perceive color is kind of based on our evolutionary history. We're used to seeing a blue sky. It doesn't matter that much. It's not threatening. So we don't have high sensitivity for blue color, and we perceive that as a background color, whereas red is typically perceived as a danger. It could be a fire, something you have to pay attention to. So it's something we have high sensitivity and we perceive as a foreground color. So while this is a weird color combination, it would be worse to put the red as a background color. And here is an example of something that I wish one of my professors had learned about. I remember I had this book where he was trying to save space by writing all the way into the margins with small letters. The problem you get then is your eyes cannot easily follow the lines, so you have to use a ruler or a pen or something like that. Now newspapers, especially in the old days, typically had to use a lot of small letters and very large pages because it was expensive to print multiple pages. So how did they solve this problem? Well, simple, they use columns. This is the simple solution. I'm a bit surprised sometimes that people don't realize this. Now, if you have enough space, just use larger fonts. It's another simple solution. So how do humans read? It's easy to think about the way you read is kind of how it is in elementary school, that you're just reading each character one at a time, but you're just doing it faster. But it's not really how you actually read. In fact, even though we are using a phonetic alphabet, we do in a lot of ways read a lot like how Chinese would read with Chinese characters. We look at words as distinct shapes that we identify immediately. So for this reason, Britain in the 1960s realized through research that the usage of capital letters on signs was actually not a good idea. And they switched to using small letters because you can see here they give a more distinct shape, which makes it easier for you to identify what you're reading. So how does that affect your user interface design? Well, if you create a bunch of options, it's easy to sort of fall in this trap. You're writing these kind of first words very similar, customized tools, custom shows, custom animations. So for somebody scanning down this list, they're seeing basically the same shape on every line, which makes it take a longer time to identify the different options. Instead, you should try to rearrange how you write this so that you're putting a more distinct word that has a different shape in the beginning, like tool, preset, and so on. Another thing I think you would often see is that people, when they have different options, they have this long sentence that look exactly the same, and then the option comes at the end. Try to avoid that. Take this long sentence, move it out, and then just list the actual distinct choices. So let's talk a bit about human memory. We'll begin with short-term memory. One thing you often hear about this is that we can remember 5 to 7 items. Now, what do we mean by that? It's basically if you have a list of items and you're asked to memorize those for 20 seconds, 30 seconds, and then you have to turn the page and you have to list down the things that you saw. Now, as computer engineers, it might be easy to think about these 5 to 7 items as meaning, oh, it's 5 to 7 bytes or word or something like that. But the human brain doesn't work like that. So it's not about the actual information content, but it's about what you can actually chunk into logical units. So for instance, if I'm asked to remember words that have just arbitrary collections of letters, then the units are actually not the words. They're going to be the single letters. I have to remember the individual letters, so then I can remember maybe a single word that has 5 to 7 letters. On the other hand, if there are words that I actually recognize, I can actually chunk the information, then I can remember, say, 5 to 7 words. You could have similar things with numbers, especially if those numbers make in some way sense to you. So, yeah, don't take this 5 to 7 items completely literal. It's related to how you can associate that kind of information. So what exactly is short-term memory? It's basically just what is you're currently concentrating on right now. So if you're about to do some particular task, somebody calls, after the call you might, and you're getting back to your original task, you might forget exactly what is it that I was doing. So what are the implications for UI design? So for instance, if I Google, I write in a query string, and then I look at the query result. As I'm looking down the results, I might actually forget what is it that I was querying. So that's why you can see Google puts the query string there to remind you what actually was your query. You can see similar things if you're filtering. I'm filtering on some files here, and you can see the query relations. It also applies to things like tabs. It's not important what this is, kind of domain specific. But what you often see is that you need information on one tab to refer to it back on other tabs, and that's not a good design. So in this case, this is something I was working on. We had this kind of information was needed for other tabs. So these things that are down here, these used to be other tabs. And by putting them into separate buttons where you can pop up dialogues, you can look at that same information at the same time. So it's something worth keeping in mind when you're working with tabs is maybe you should rearranged it a bit different so that people don't have to flick back and forth between tabs. So our short-term memory, it also suggests that we should limit the usage of modes. So modes are basically things that change what your clicks in your application, what they're going to mean. It could be in a graphic application, and you click on a different tool. And it's easy to forget exactly what you were doing. So by changing the mouse cursor, because you're constantly looking at that, you get reminded what kind of tool am I actually using at this moment. Now, long-term memory has different problems. It's not that it just suddenly disappears, but it has full of holes. It's inaccurate. So you need some kind of augmentation to assist you. So one way to help you with that is to have consistency in your UI. Place OK and the cancel buttons the same kind of places. Use the same kind of icons that mean the same thing repeatedly. One recommendation also seen is to use these labels. So there's a file manager where you can, on Mac on the top, where you can use color labels. So they don't actually have any kind of semantic meaning in the application, but they can help people remind them of things. Below is a file manager called Easel on Linux. It's used these emblems or little pictures that you can attach to files and folders. So let's talk a little bit about trade-offs. I think it's important when you do UI design, you have to accept that you cannot actually satisfy everyone. So a classic case of this is that you redesign a user interface that isn't that nice to make it easier to use. Your new users are very happy about this because now they understand how to use your application. Your existing users, on the other hand, are not so happy. And this is something that I think you see with a lot of applications. A company makes an application that's fairly successful. They start getting more users. They keep developing new features. And as you're adding new features, who are they going to talk to when they're adding new things? Well, they're going to talk to their existing users, and preferably the most advanced users. And what happens is that you start listening to them, and they say, oh, I want this extra little button and this dialogue. I want this extra little feature here. And for them, it's very easy to add these things because they already know all those parts of the user interface. They don't have to learn that. It's just one extra piece of information to add. The problem with this is you gradually paint yourself into a corner. You're adding more and more stuff, which is fine for your existing users, but you're pushing away all potential new users, for which this will become too much of a barrier and complexity. And so, as my point is, if you want to make a friendly user interface, you probably have to upset some users. It's kind of hard to avoid that. You just have to accept that reality. Brings me to another point, which is when you're trying to improve one feature, that often comes at the expense of others. But how do you decide which ones you should improve? So for that, we use something called the 80-20 rule. And that's based on this observation that about 20% of the features are used about 80% of the time. So this isn't a hard rule. It's basically just a way of stating that there's a minority of features that are used most of the time. So for instance, there was a company called Palm. I'm not sure if anyone used Palm Pilot before. They were quite rigorous about applying this rule. So they would do extensive testing and figure out what are these 20% features. So for instance, in Palm, I was a very big fan of Palm. They had so that they identified that just make an appointment at the same day you're at. That's the most frequent thing to do. So that was just a single tap to do that. Whereas doing in a repeated appointment would require more clicks. That was kind of more hidden away, but that's fine. If it's not used as often, you can afford to do more clicks. So let's look at some hands-on about some UI controls. So this is kind of, I just call this category for list builders, different ways of selecting multiple elements. So the most straightforward way is a list box. You click on things you want to select. You can take a step up. You have the add remove list. You see what you actually selected, But if you want to add something more, you click on the plus button and you can get up some new kind of dialog where you have new selections that you can add. So this is what you see with file dialogs, for instance. Or you can use a list builder. So here you see on the left, you see what you can select from, and on the right would be the selections you made. So you can use these arrows to move back and forth. Or it could just be to put things in different categories. So what are the pros and cons of these different things? Well, the list box is very small. It takes very small real estate. Of course, it doesn't give you a good overview. If you have a lot of elements, you have to scroll up and down to see your selections. So this is best when you have few elements. The add remove list, it's compact, doesn't take a lot of space. On the other hand, it requires a bit more mouse clicks to use. One thing that's really good about it, though, is that you can offer specialized object pickers. So for instance, if there's files, you can have, show a dialog with a hierarchical view where you can pick things. And then we have the list builder at the bottom here. It gives you a great overview over what is selected and what are your selectable items. The bad thing, of course, is it's big. It takes a lot of space. It's best to use when you have a lot of elements, and in particular when order matters, because you can add buttons at the side here to be able to rearrange, for instance, the list here. So let's look at some more regular components like checkboxes and drop-down boxes and so on. Now, you don't need to read through all this. This is just to show an idea I had at one of the companies I worked for, which the challenge is often to get people to read things like user interface guidelines. These texts can be long and boring. And so this was an idea of creating a poster that we can have in the office. So whenever you're trying to decide what is the best choice in this case, should I have a drop-down box? Should I have radio buttons? What's the best choice? You can actually go through this list and it will ask you questions and it will guide you to the right choice. But here is a condensed version of this. So considering whether you have multiple or single choices first, so say we're going to select multiple choices. If there's less than 10, then checkboxes are a good choice. They give a good overview of what you can select. If you have more, it might be good to have a scrollable list so it doesn't take up as much space. You can have a scrollable list where you just click and select things, or you can have checkboxes. There's pros and cons to both of those choices. If there's only a single choice, radio buttons are really good when you don't have too many options, because they give you a very good overview over what actually your choices are. But if there's more choices, you might want to have a scrollable list and not use as much space. And that gives you also the option of adding, say, a field at the top here where you can do sorting or filtering. Because if there's 100 different choices, it's not going to be user-friendly to use radio buttons. You need some way of filtering those choices and make it easier and quicker for the user to identify the choices. And in some special cases, it's useful to use a drop-down box or a combo box. These are useful when you know exactly what kind of choices is in the list. So for instance, if there's months of the year, or like you can see here, colors, you don't need to look at every option. You know basically what's going to be there. And so you don't require the overview that these other options give you. It's also sometimes used when you have a default choice that you very rarely change. Okay, so let's talk about icon design. And I'm saying here without the fluff. And the reason for that is if you try to Google and learn more about that, it's very often that they say things like make your icons delightful or enticing, or it's often not very concrete advice on how to do that. So I want to be a bit more specific about how to think about icon design. So these are quite small icons from Microsoft Office that I blown up. Yeah, unfortunately, I'm going to be a little bit mean to Microsoft here. I'm not a fan of a lot of how they think about icon design. So if you look at these icons, first of all, so this is a rhetorical question, what are these icons for? If you haven't seen used these functionality before, I bet that most of you can't quite guess what exactly these are for. At least I can't, but I don't use Office very much. So some of the issues you see, some of the things you notice here is that all of these icons are basically a collection of little icons. You have one picture here and then another one pointing that there's something happens as the next one. So I think what a problem here is sometimes a picture isn't worth 1,000 words. What Microsoft is essentially doing here is they're reinventing hieroglyphics. So you're trying to tell a story by showing a bunch of pictures. But there's a reason why we invented the alphabets. Letters and combining them are much better for expressing abstract ideas in particular. So that's why I think you can say sometimes a word is worth 1,000 pictures. So how should you design icons then? What should you be thinking about? So here's an example of what I would consider good icon design. Now this is radically different. Compared to these Microsoft icons, there's very little details here. There's very simple shapes. They're clearly distinct. You can tell them apart. Like when you add a lot of complexity, you suddenly, it's like, at a glance, it looks the same. So these are some of the good things about it. It's based on established conventions. You see these on music, instrument, equipment. They're clearly distinct shapes. You can clearly identify them from each other. And these are designed for recall and not to be intuitive. So remember what I said about long-term memory, that you want to be able to have something that can jog your memory, that augments your memory. And that is really what these are for. They're not designed so that, oh, I can look at this and then I can read it like a hieroglyph, like what it's actually supposed to mean. Now, I say that these are based on established conventions, but of course, at some point, they were not an established convention. But I would still say they were good icons because the first person, say they used a Sony Walkman and didn't know what these buttons meant, they would click on these buttons and they would figure out over time what they mean. And the point of these icons afterwards is that they serve as a reminder. So you're thinking, what do I play with? Well, the arrow, that kind of gives an indication, oh, it's pointing to some direction, it's moving in some direction. That's probably playing. The square doesn't indicate a direction. That can kind of jog your memory that that's the thing for stopping the playing. So that's how you should think about icons, I think, is when somebody has learned your interface, can your icons help jog somebody's memory efficiently? So here's some other examples from Microsoft. These are, on the top, you can see there's a myriad of icons that Microsoft used for adding something in the software. So again, they use this kind of hieroglyph approach of having an object that says, what am I adding? And then, you know, the action, the plus symbol. At the bottom, this is from Excel. Again, you have two icons. So it dominates what you're actually doing something to, the cell, whereas the part is actually, the action is quite small. So the important thing, the action, is actually de-emphasized. Now, part of the reason why they have to do this in Windows is because you have so many icons. You have to have some way of distinguishing them. So how do you solve this problem? You use one of the principles I talked about, proximity. So what you use is context. So if you look at, this is from Apple software, you see the plus and the minus button. You wonder, well, what are they adding? They're not superimposed on any kind of symbol that tells me what I'm adding. Well, what you do is you look at the proximity. What are they closest? Close to a list. It has a header. It says preferred networks. I bet these buttons are for adding preferred networks. So if you think about it, if you apply the kind of Microsoft logic here to add buttons, what you would probably have seen here, okay, I'm exaggerating a bit, but then you have one little icon here that represents preferred something, and superimposed on that is an icon representing a network, and superimposed on that you have a little plus symbol. So you can imagine how that would quickly get very complex, and the icons would not be easily distinguishable. So how do you use context? Well, you can use sections, or you can use headlines, as you've seen here. Let's look at some other examples. This is from Microsoft Visual Studio. You have a lot of icons in the top toolbars here, and you need some ways of adding details to these icons to distinguish them from each other. For instance, you have the debug icons. They're shared with all these other icons around here. So that means you cannot use too generic designs, because then you wouldn't be able to distinguish them. And you also notice that proximity principle isn't really applied here. The debug buttons are fairly far away from actually a lot of the sort of debug functionality that you see down here. So how can you solve this kind of approach? So I'm going to show you how they've done it in Xcode, which is Apple's sort of default integrated development environment. We're going to just start with some of these ideas of being able to use abstract and simple icons that are primarily about jogging your memory and not telling you what they are. So if you look at the top here, these are icons for showing you different parts of the user interface, like different sections or panes. One of these are for showing you the debug area. You can't tell that from looking at this initially, but they're not designed to be intuitive initially. They're designed for recall. So if this was a Microsoft software, they might have drawn a little bug to indicate it's the debug panel, maybe a little square to indicate it's a pane. And you see here it's a very simple approach instead. And if you follow where you get the blue highlight, you can see if you can understand the system that they're using. So you see, now I'm showing the left pane, and you can see the leftmost is highlighted in blue, the right one, and the bottom one. So there's a kind of a correspondence here between these sort of little bar inside the square and what's pane you're showing. So you would have to click through these and see what actually is there first. You have to learn the interface. But once you've done that, these help you remind you what actually opens these panes. Another example, you can switch between different modes with this one. Again, it's not obvious what these icons mean. There's some hints there that help you later, which is like you can see these two of the other icons, they have two elements in them. So it indicates that there's two of something. And if you see here, both of these create a split screen. The last one with the arrows in either end, this allows you to go back and forth in two different windows. So back and forth in time, two arrows pointing to each direction. It kind of just jogs your memory once you have learned that's what it's about. So let's look at how they use context with the debugger in Xcode. So if I open the debug panel, you can see now that the debug buttons are actually down in the debug section. They're not up in the rest of the toolbar. That's why I see the toolbar is so simple, because you're putting all the debug functionality together with the stack backtrace, the debug console, and so on. Let's do another example. This is from Microsoft Office. This is how it kind of looked last time I was actively using Windows. Maybe a reason why I left. So of course it's an exaggeration, but I think the point is that it was getting kind of out of hand the way they did it. And so Microsoft developed this ribbon interface that you can see here that tried to improve on this problem. And I think it's an improvement, but it still has a number of problems. So one of the things I want to call attention to here, these are color wells. And you can see they have superimposed these icons to kind of try to tell you what color are they affecting. So one, the bucket, that's affecting the background color, and the A, that indicates it's a font. So the problem here is that you have to have these different icons on top of every color well to sort of indicate what it's for. In Apple software, there's only one color well icon, really. So how do they manage to distinguish these different cases? Well, they utilize context. So what I highlighted here, you can see two sections. There's a fill and a border section. So you can see, for instance, in the border section, you have all sorts of UI controls for controlling border properties. And so it naturally follows that the color well here applies to the color of the border. And likewise with the color well that you see with the fill. Or when you look at the far end here, the font, you can see I don't need to have superimposed a little A on top of the color well. It's obvious that it applies to color because it's in the color section. So I want to just say a few words about colors, shapes, and icons. When you think about design, it's preferable to think about how would you design it first, just monochrome, like black and white, because that tells you whether you're giving your icons a good icon silhouette that is really what makes it identifiable. And you see, there's a problem with some of these Microsoft icons is they don't have good silhouettes. They often get these kind of squarish things because they have so much complexity in them. Once you have selected the silhouette, the overall shape, you can select 2 to 3 colors. You can see here on iOS, they have there's 2 or 3 primary colors, like message that's just white and green, calendar has white, black, and red, and so on. Let's talk a little bit about the uses of colors together with shapes. So these are icons that are used in Microsoft Office. And you can see that there's a lot of squarish looking icons, and they're all having this blue, gray, and white color scheme. So they're not really, they don't stand out from each other. It seems like these colors are just chosen for more of an aesthetic reason. So you can compare that with the kind of Office package, if you will, on Apple, Apple iWork. These are some of the icons available. Now, if you have 2 icons that are quite similar in shape, like table and guidelines are squarish, you can see the color is completely different. That's to be able to distinguish things that are of similar shape. If they're very similar in usage, like lock and unlock, then the shapes are similar and the colors are similar. And again, you have play and rehearse, somewhat related, so they have a similar shape, but the color scheme is completely different. So I was going to go through some examples of bad design. I'm not going to get much time for that, so I'm just going to go through that quickly. It's bad usage of spacing here. This is trying to clean that up. Separating 2 groups, spacing between the subgroups here, indentation. We had, I'm showing you here that you can have the complex design kind of intentionally made bad. Here's an example. These are squeezed too much together. Where does this help text go? Here we clean up, we created some bit more better hierarchy here to see what's, the master detail kind of thinking, to see what's affecting what. So I'm just going to click through this stuff here and go to, let me just do the recap here first. So basically what I get across is that you should pay attention to where things are placed. So because that tells you about the relationship between the components, the visual hierarchy, what component controls another component. And I'm trying to say that you should prioritize discoverability and recall over intuitiveness. Now, of course, if you can make something intuitive, that's great. Just do that. But don't go all your way so that you're reinventing hieroglyphics. Try to think about how, when someone has learned your user interface, how can you use interface to help jog their memory? So one way of doing that is if you have a bunch of options, what you often see in a lot of software is you change a bunch of options and you click apply and then you see something change. The problem with that is it's very hard to learn the software, how it works. If you look at a lot of Apple software, almost any option you change has an immediate effect. You drag on a color slider, you see the color change immediately. And the point of that is that it allows you to get feedback and understand how the software works. And to make people not afraid of doing that, you have to offer undo through your user interface. So if people can do whatever they want and they know they can get back to whatever they're doing with undo, it will allow them to start exploring and learn your interface. So I think that's a better approach than having an apply button where they ask, are you really sure you want to do this? This might screw up something. It doesn't really invite people to explore and learn the software. And then the other point is exploit context to simplify a UI. I hope I was able to show you how if you rearrange where you see the UI components and you put them next to each other logically, you can greatly simplify your user interface. And then finally, when you're using shape and colors, try to think about if shapes are similar, but they're representing entirely different things, then use different color, and vice versa. So if the color is very similar, but it's not the same thing, then try to have different shapes. So that should conclude my talk.